To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you so much for your support, as always. Share the show with your friends and keep posting about your favorite episodes. It's a holiday weekend. Happy 4th of July, I guess. To celebrate America today, the panel is going to consider the history of one of the most popular social welfare programs of the 20th century. We are talking, of course, about the shit show that is Medicare.
Yeah, you know, it's a barbecue in which we will roast different elements of Medicare.
I mean, yeah, I think it's really important to look into the actual history of this and kind of what some of the compromises in it are that were baked in from the get-go. Right. And kind of why they've had these almost like tragic comic cascading effects in the time period after and like including into today. I kind of think of this topic as Medicare first as farce and then as tragedy.
Yeah, I always I think about it as like in the classic Greek tragedy setup, you know, you've got your hubris, you've got your like the second part, you're like ruin, follow your delusion, and you have your like nemesis right at the end, right? And I always feel like the way that I first like learned the history, it was in this very hubristic like way that we had these like legislative 12-dimensional chess players and just the legislative genius of doing this, and you know this is like very, very crafty like political success. But I think when you back up and look at the whole frame of like what was happening, you see everything that was left on the table. You see what was included in ways that like divided the future coalitions for reform. So taking a sort of Greek tragedy perspective, I think might actually be useful here.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons we wanted to talk about this today in particular is because after what felt like, I think, building momentum for several years behind Medicare for All and other pushes for like federal universal single payer, I think during the past few months, it's felt there's been sort of this deflation, or like it feels a little defeatist to be fighting for this kind of like expansive reform under the Biden administration, especially considering the fact that, you know, Biden's made his career on opposing stuff like this.
Right.
But, you know, I think despite Biden's like very clear and vehement career-long opposition to any type of like national health insurance, it is really important in our contemporary context to understand that this is not just a fight happening in a vacuum, right? It's not just about the context right now under Biden. There's a much more like deep and richer history that if you start to dig into not just like the idea of Medicare passing writ large one day and, you know, almost the sort of divine creation myth of one day there is Medicare and Medicaid, and that's the sort of modern era of healthcare. And that hides the sort of truer story that shows, you know, why it passed and what those issues were of who was left out, and how who was left out and who was at the table basically becomes like what sets a lot of the stage for the situation that we're dealing with now.
I think that's a really good context to put it in terms of right now, especially because looking at this is, I think in some ways this will follow from, but not require having listened to at all, a previous episode that we did last fall, which is called A Death Panel History of Socialized Medicine, where we talked about some of the history immediately preceding this, and the sort of rallying cry, like the emergence of like physician groups organized through the AMA as this like very powerful collective force that like mobilized their members to basically do a completely organized like disinformation campaign saying that any sort of national health insurance reform in the United States was part of the Red Menace, was socialized medicine, was all this bullshit stuff that like the same talking points really that perpetuate into today. Basically, the way that we are going to approach this history, probably in a way that I think it's really relevant to approach this history, is looking through the actions and reactions essentially of a lot of the really vested interest groups in this. And that's, when I say like interest groups, I don't mean just, industry groups and things like that, which I think we're used to thinking of things as, but also the mobilization of people both within things like organized labor, but also outside of it, like the mobilization just of people And be the reason I'm saying, like, I think it's really important the way that you set this up is because in some part, moments like right now are exactly the perfect time to continue to build and do a big push for something like socialized medicine, because again and again you see, if you even glance at these histories, you see these moments of severe demobilization that are largely, I think, done by either such and such fails to pass and becomes like seen as politically unrealizable in that moment in time, or actually, as in the case of Medicare, which I think we'll argue, which maybe is a good transition to get us into starting to really talk about the history. As in the case of Medicare, something passes actually, and it totally changes the course of the way sort of like political mobilization is done towards something like national health insurance. And so, just as we could say, I think, we're aware, for example, like over the course of the last couple of years, obviously we've been really actively gunning for Medicare for all and things like that. And now even some of the people who over the last couple of years were and have been the most vocal proponents of it within the quote unquote like halls of power or whatever, within Congress or wherever. People like Bernie Sanders, for example, are focusing on stuff like, let's lower the Medicare eligibility age to something like 55. Let's include vision and dental in Medicare. And one thing that is important to understand historically is it's not really about what those people think is possible to achieve and what their goals ultimately are. I think, Bernie Sanders, for example, retreating to like, it's, realistically, maybe in the political time frame that we're working with in the next few years, we can get these sort of expansions to Medicare. When you see retreats like that, I think, it reminds me of things that I'm not even sure that we'll get to later exactly, but people like Ted Kennedy, for example, after having spent a long portion of his career advocating for a national health insurance program, eventually sort of like retreats into, okay, reforms, right? And so a big part of the sort of like ability to create moments where major systemic changes is possible is making sure that there is a sustained public pressure.
Right. So, and as I think we're going to see, like the story of Medicare itself reveals that the particular people that are framed as the beneficiaries matter a lot. And I think the fascinating thing, we can start with this to like get into the history, is to think about like, where does the pressure for these sorts of systems tend to come from in the political economy? And cross-nationally, it always begins with organized labor. The labor movement kind of in a variety of countries has been like key to like pushing for systems of national health insurance. But I think the fascinating thing where the history of Medicare itself starts is that national health insurance was like not necessarily at all on organized labor's agenda. In fact, quite explicitly, by the time that Medicare is being debated in the 1960s, it's not. And I think it's worth going into like why that is.
Yeah.
Right. Because during the 1940s, you have American trade unions really focusing on expanding collective bargaining rights, on trying to secure, what's called sort of individual fringe benefits for specific working groups instead of working on like campaigns for national health insurance. And so what you actually do have is sort of in the 40s and 50s, the focus of labor's attention allows these group employer plan products to develop and become incredibly lucrative things for insurance companies to get into because, again, unions are sort of bargaining for these collective health benefits instead of a broader government paid for national health insurance. And, really a lot of what starts to become a problem is that as people retire, as they become disabled, unions start to run into funding issues when it comes to paying for the pensions and care, or sometimes healthcare for retired and disabled workers was not included at all. So unions start to really come under pressure when they have large portions of their membership population start to retire. Of course, this is also happening amid like what's happening politically, where unions' power is starting to be restricted. So like as the 50s progress, I think unions get very increasingly like worried about having to financially provide for all of their pensioners,
Right.
and start to shift their pressure towards, okay, we need to, not just go after individual employers to cover health benefits. We need to also, apply pressure politically in order to take some of the pressure off of covering all of the retirees' pensions and healthcare.
Well, and also I think around this period, or sort of post World War II, you had seen really the rise of what is sort of like the precursor to what are our contemporary health insurance companies, and largely in part actually tied to the actions of labor at the time. During the war, basically there was a wage freeze, and so securing things like health benefits through employers guaranteeing health insurance to union members became this thing where basically through, and in part through act of Congress too, where like you have a basically like a tax act passed in I think 42, where they say that like employer contributions essentially to employee health insurance are not taxed as wages. And so like this entire industry develops into its own formal lobby, really, after that point. And and you start to see basically, so you've got these things like, organized labor has one sort of this like, you see a lot of this in the literature referred to as like quite literally as like a private welfare state.
Right.
Like they had won, they had won these protections in the form of private health insurance through employers. And in some sense, the sort of originating form of the Medicare fight comes from, as B kind of alluded to, well, we have the problem of like, we have these retirees who are uncared for. We have workers who either are disabled simply because they were disabled, or became disabled because a lot of industrial labor is very disabling, right? And, the question arises like, how do we basically win specifically protections or benefits or what have you for that group of people, for sort of people, especially under this sort of deservingness framework of like,
they've worked hard their whole lives.
Exactly.
They
are former workers, right?
Right, exactly.
And there's also, I think it's worth just pointing out one other thing, which is that the way that health benefits get included as something that you can collectively bargain for is in 1947, actually in the Taft-Hartley Act, which is by, for those of you playing at home, the same bill that allows states to pass right to work laws.
Right.
So, and the political context for that is this huge conservative backlash against unions after this wave of sit-down strikes in the middle 40s. And, and really this like, increasing intensity of like Red Scare, and anti-union kind of organizing by employers. And so this is like, you can see this as one sort of additional thing that unions are trying to like secure these collective bargaining benefits so that they can essentially maintain their ranks as well. So, that the sort of anti-communist politics is it's never like the top line thing that you see in the history, but you all have to think like that's the context in which organized labor is always operating.
Oh yeah,
especially in the 40s and 50s. So that's really important that they're like trying to secure these bread and butter benefits for their constituents, because this is like they're under assault. Right.
And it's really actually during this 20-year period between the end of World War II and the passage of Medicare in 1965 where private insurance's power actually is solidified. Like in a lot of ways, when the American labor movement mobilizes its extensive networks to start trying to advocate for stuff like Medicare and Social Security, disability insurance, covering the people that they can't provide for with their pension funds anymore. They're really fighting a problem of their own making in many ways, because the power of private insurance companies arises out of the wins of the labor movement, right? That's a very clear, it's an unfortunate consequence of having one robust, large health insurance programs to the point that, employer-sponsored health insurance becomes sort of an understood truth, right? As a policy reality and as a reality under like American capitalism. This is like how healthcare became known as how it was paid for, right? So when unions are turning to start to organize in order to try and pass national health insurance programs, the people that they're actually fighting were able to gain power and influence through the work of the unions.
Well, and it's interesting because it starts not necessarily as unions fighting for a national health insurance program. If it starts more as this, unions fighting for a not even a disability health insurance program, but a disability insurance program, something like guaranteed. Like basically they had this problem. It's stated they had this problem that, disabled workers essentially qualified for no public pension until they reached Social Security age 65, because Social Security had been previously passed. And then actually what's interesting is as soon as the unions start to identify this sort of population as a group, like a constituency that they want to mobilize and basically fight for a public benefit for, you see very explicitly private insurance companies identify that as an existential potential threat, that once they win, that once, for instance, just this, extension of, for instance, Social Security to the disabled is one that it's only a matter of time before private insurance companies are out of business and, the administration of health is done by the government. I want to read from this book by Jill Quidagno called One Nation Uninsured, which is an extension of, it's kind of like an expansion of the in the previous episode where we've the episode that I mentioned, a death panel history of socialized medicine, we drew pretty heavily from this Jill Quidagno article called Why the United States Has No National Health Insurance. And this is kind of eventually this is like early 2000s, she turned it into a full book and expanded to some of the stories here. So I'm going to be reading from that. Again, it's called One Nation Uninsured. So she establishes basically the AFL and the AFL-CIO was formed basically. I mean, this was a huge, contextually, this was a huge monumental change. And I'm gonna read this from Quidagno's book on how they sort of approached things immediately after their joining. Quote, "The AFL-CIO decided to tackle the disability issue first. Disability benefits were a union concern because disabled workers had no government benefits until they became eligible for Social Security at age 65. That placed the burden of their support on the unions. Some unions negotiated benefits for disabled members in their collective bargaining agreements, but in return had to make concessions on wage increases for working members. Thus, the incentive to shift this cost to the government was intense. In 1956, the AFL-CIO made the fight for disability insurance, quote, a kind of wedding ceremony. The AMA goes on to, again, directly like fight this. And they say, even though disability benefits involved no medical care, the AMA, the American Medical Association, the lobbying group for physicians, basically, the AMA feared any measure that would allow the government to extend its reach. When the Advisory Council on Social Security had recommended disability benefits in its 1947 report, the AMA had fought it, quote, tooth and nail. According to Ig Falk, they thought, quote, oh, this is just a camel getting his nose under the tent, and therefore they opposed it, they being doctors as a lobbying group. Because the next thing, you'd have a broader disability program, and the next thing, you'll be giving medical care to the disabled. So
funny.
Yeah, and that's pretty characteristic, right, of the AMA's approach to everything. Like I think I've said this before, but we know of a bill that the AMA opposed, which was in fact a mosquito abatement bill in the early 1950s. That they're like, if this mosquito abatement bill passes, it's gonna be Stalinism in the United States.
Oh my God.
Yeah, this is pretty characteristic of their whole shtick.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
But I think what's interesting, right, is
to hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, The death panel.